Okay, Dr. Tull, thank you for inviting me again to make this presentation. I am a member of the creative industries as a classical musician, but I also um, consider myself to be a commercial creativity developer. And I also work at the National Cultural Foundation of Barbados, where I'm head of their business development department. I've taken a completely different approach to the whole notion of the creative industries, and you will see in this presentation that we do have a focus on fashion, but it's about the deconstruction for a reconstruction that fits our model in Barbados. We look at design, creativity, business development, value chain development, development of production and consumption communities, what you may refer to as markets, which brings us to the whole notion of using the creative industries to drive communities and their own economies. And when we talk about economies, we're talking about economic activity that may happen in small groups or in large groups or in countries or within countries in villages, etc. Because as you know, they are highly developed economies, but countries, sorry, but they have great disparities in economies that exist for them. And so the whole notion of creativity and clusters and the way they can help plus communities where they can help economies to grow. And the idea of whether this is a notion or a fact is something that I would have explored when I was doing my second master's at Goldsmiths University in the UK. And I was examining the entire notion of how the global north, I'm sure that's a concept that your professor would have been sharing with you, was using raw materials, the artisanal skills, and the existence of poverty in less developed economies in specific countries to produce products that they, the global north, um, began to own and for their own global north consumption. And there is a big debate about the inequality and of economics and creativity with the global north versus the global south. And this is against the backdrop that nations such as Singapore, China, India, large populations in the world with inequalities in their regional economies were now redefining their place in the global supply chain and repositioning themselves as owners of these things which they were creating, and also increasing their mass consumption, reducing the export to the global north, and hence giving themselves the opportunity to control these new economies. And of course, I'm sure many of you know The Creative Economy by John Hopkins, perfect read. But the need to control the value chains, the need for these nations to become their own designers, control their own narrative and pricing, was essentially responsible for the great shift that you see occurring with the East in terms of the movement of the control by the West and Western countries like the USA and parts of Europe. Growth in ownership and investment by nationals in production and supply chain components occurred. Increase in modernization of skill towards global competitiveness and leadership, increase in technology and ownership, IP driven, um, as well was the focus in terms of the innovation led by market innovation, increase in generic productions at global standards. So they now could also have an increase in consumption by their own communities. That impacted on the increase of employment of skills by these locals, and of course, a growth of consumption by of these products, not just by their own communities, but by global markets as well. And there is a little image here by Peter Durand, which kind of talks about how the creative class functions and how the growth occurs and how you can shift global creativity in a way that moves it kind of from the global north to kind of like the global south. And you can see here they start at the whole idea of the value that comes with design. So for fashion designers, for designers who are in the area of, and I hope that you're seeing fashion from more of a lifestyle perspective, and therefore fashion can be clothing and accessories. It could be health and beauty. It could be accents for homes, etc. I hope you all have been thinking of fashion from that perspective and not just runway only concept. So this shift in the model for these countries caused us to really think about what could happen to smaller countries like Barbados and parts of the Caribbean and the global South that would really help us to transform the way we see ourselves and impact on our communities. So we know that there is at the heart of the creative city is community. And that's one of the first things we started to try to think about. That was in our ideation stage. A community of consumers, a community of designers and artisans, a community of suppliers, manufacturers, retailers, logistics providers, and a community of financiers. These exist within our own communities. And we may not always see them because of the siloed activity that occurs. But if we could pull them all together and deploy them, what we were looking at is how could that change and shift this model. I've given you an example here of the textile and apparel sectors in Nigeria, and they kind of applied a similar model. They got some funding through the ITC for their she trade process, and this is how they are now controlling the narrative from their perspective in terms of fashion. And you can also see them at major showcases such as New York Now trade fairs, where they are selling a lot of their work to global consumers. So, as I said, it was the whole idea of how do we bring this to the neck, bring all of this to my neck of the woods, tucked away in the global south. And I use the word tucked away because as much as we in the Caribbean see ourselves, some people don't even know or recognize that we exist. And it required that we had to look at our own deficiencies. We also had to pay attention to how far behind we were in terms of technology, in terms of processes, in terms of design thinking, all that. And then the global discussion of culture during this period was specifically looking at the cultural and creative industries in our region, but globally, people were talking about creative economies. So that kind of put us in a place of really recognizing immediately where we were and what we needed to do. So when we started to examine the situation in Barbados as a case study from my master's at the time, we recognized that there was little to no infrastructure for production. Many of the plants that existed for manufacturing on a wide scale, particularly in the areas of fashion, accents, etc., had virtually by 2012 come to a standstill and non-existent. Logistics, raw material points, all of these were quite few and not really what they needed to be. There was also an impact of raw material development that was occurring. So we no longer grew the indigo plant for dyes. We had fewer fields that were producing cotton, and the cotton that we did produce, we were selling to the Italians, who then sold it back to us at 450% what they paid for. There wasn't a sharing of the artisanal skills. So you were having fewer designers who were sharing the design skill. You were having fewer people who were sharing the manufacturing skill. No one was there to build tech packs, etc. And then there was little to no investment in the creative industries, except from the grants that governments were providing, and many of those were quite insufficient. Attempts at innovation were not market-led. A lot of them tended to be driven by personal goals, and there was no research in terms of the market and what the market needed. And essentially, we had no ecosystems that were working. Our community of consumers were not consuming local products, but rather consuming 98% of the global products imported. So we had in 2012 just around 352 small stores littered across Bridgetown of these, these little one-door stores, and they were selling everything that was imported from the US and China, and very little to nothing at all that was actually produced by Barbadian designers. Our community of consumers were excluded because what we created locally, on the other hand, was destined for tourists. So what you found was that the local designers, because they couldn't get into the stores, were going on the beaches and selling their clothes, or they would try to put some of their clothing in hotels. So locals were then disadvantaged and not able to consume anything that was produced by locals. And I think the rationale for that was that within the hotels on the beaches, you could produce small quantities and probably just sell, 10 or 15 a week, versus the ability to sell like 1,000 units or 2,000 units a month, which is where we need to be thinking. So I also examined some of the research that would have been done. You had Dr. Nurse, as Dr. Tull is indicating, would have done a lot of work. Dr. Tull herself would have contributed a lot of studies as well through these examples I've given you here. We also had a number of other persons around the region who had given a full 10 years of solid research and academic studies and had made several recommendations for a way forward for the region. But we just were not having the reactions and the responses from governments that we needed to have to cause this change to occur. So in 2015, after about, I would say, more than 10 years of study and submission of different papers and positions, the Barbados Culture Industries Act was finally passed. And through a legislative and fiscal framework, we were able to have this act written in law. It had a provision of baskets of concessions for cultural entrepreneurs. Ironically, in 2013, we visited Trinidad and we spent some time there with your artist registry, and we were able then to grow and make some changes to our artist registry to contribute to this. But I digress there. We also established a specific agency at the time to manage the provisions of the Act. That was the Culture Industry Development Authority, a provision of the establishment of a Culture Industries Fund, which never actually got the funding, the $20 million that was promised to us, Dr. Tull. Never came in. And then we we then had to look at a small budget that we had to really start some of these activities. There was also 100% deduction of revenue from investors. People who invested in creatives could get 100% of that revenue written off when they were filing their taxes. So for example, if Dr. Tull at the time had given me $100,000 towards a fashion collection in 1 year, and she was someone who was generating $800,000 in revenue annually, when she goes to file her taxes, she would only have paid taxes on $700,000. They would have deducted the $700,000, and that was something that can happen for 5 consecutive years. So even though she invested in 1 year, for 5 consecutive years, she could have that deduction of the $100,000 as she was filing. So she would pay less. She would pay less taxes because it would be a reduced amount of the money she earned. And then we had duty-free waivers and VAT exemption on imported tools of goods. So if you had machines, if you had fabric, if you had notions, if you had electronic things that were needed for your design tech packs, etc., all those you could import and you paid absolutely no duties on them. So the act from a legislative and a fiscal framework was certainly set out to be stimulating, and we did see some persons who took advantage of it because it was really meant to be propelling the sector. So this became the kind of the catalyst for the transformation of the creative industries. And as I said, it had been thought about. Our former Prime Minister, Owen Arthur, had set up a task force that included a lot of what we would call experts in law, experts in culture, experts in business to really look at this. But it took literally from 2003 to 2015 to have that act passed. So this was really the planting of a seed. And so by that time, I had graduated to come back to Barbados, and I was working at the Culture Industries Authority. I had helped with the act being passed, and we started to do some work. So we now needed to plant seeds. And one of the first things we did was actually to draw from the expertise of a number of persons during, this is giving me some problems here. The expertise from a number of persons from who we thought were working in the sector. So in our 2016 Culture Industries Symposium, we looked at the whole idea of preparing Barbados culture industries for investment and trade. And investment was important, but trade was also very important to us. We looked at the readiness and capacity. We looked at who to trade to, how to trade it. We looked at the re-engineering of technology and understanding technology from a trends perspective, clustering and creative cities concepts, and the whole supporting development capacity of visual arts, craft, film, festivals, and fashion sectors, because those were the sectors which we thought were crucial. So we had Oliinka from Jacobs Bonnet. Some of you may know of her. At that time, she was based in the UK, and she was doing a lot of activity in terms of strategic placement of products. We had Stuart Collins, who was responsible for some major festivals locally and in the UK. Mark Elliott, who would have been one of the founders of Digital City in Scotland. We had Nick Nash, who was into music and Emmy Award winner and director. Dr. Annalie Babb, who was an innovation and smart technology specialist. But there were two main persons here that really impacted on what we were going to be doing next. And that would be Caroline Edlin, who was a Arts Business Institute director in the US, and Luz Naranjo, who was the innovation coach and director of strategic transformation from Columbia Moda, INX Moda in Colombia, sorry. And they were very important to us because they were the people who would impact the fashion entry and development for us, and the visual arts and accents entry and development for us in those two countries, in Colombia and the US. So through those activities with them, we were then able to participate in Columbia Moda in Colombia, as well as Columbia Techs. And we were then able to trade in America's Mart in Atlanta in their apparel and home and accents trade show. And both of those activities provided our designers and our artisans the opportunity to be able to sell their products to over 3,000 buyers, and buyers who understood and who wanted handmade, homemade products that we were creating, as well as unique designs that our designers were creating. And so we I'm sorry, I think I may have gone too quickly. Yes. So through that partnership, we were able to showcase at a number of these um, activities. And the question for us is why these partners were crucial. I just explained to you there. Colombia Motor, for example, INEX Motor and Colombia had linked to 40 million consumers alone. And those are people who actually go to the trade show, who buy products from a B2C perspective, as well as those who buy products from a B2B perspective. Um, and we were able to consider how we were going to come back from those first two shows, um, look at what was trending, understood packaging, etc., and then re-enter those markets for the activity, which we hope would have generated um, orders for designs, etc., and that did also occur. Um, and America's Mart, we did the same thing, and we met with many of the wholesalers, and we did have buyers who also wanted products. So that was the opening for us. So that was our start. We knew that people were interested. We were able to validate that we did have the creativity level and production level that could compete globally. Um, and so we did have a few orders. So now we wanted to upgrade that. And we decided to use Carifesta 13 in Barbados as a way to really test how not just Barbados, but the region could perhaps also be competing at this level. So what we did, we looked at the buyer shopping mall, which I designed. I think Kevon and a few other persons would have been at Carifesta in Barbados. So we designed the whole concept of the buyer shopping mall, but we did a lot more to support the activity. So we had 12 sales um, agents who dealt with buyers in advance and who also dealt with the exhibitors. So they were able to set appointments with the buyers for the exhibitors. And that started the development of relationships between the producers and potential buyers. There were over 400 creative product types at that market. We brought 45 buyers from around the world. And we collected data on the products from the consumers, creative buyers as well. We looked at creating avatars of the products and avatars of the buyers and avatars of not just the retail buyers, but avatars of the consumers, the B2C consumers. The consultants we brought from INEX Moda, so they could also look at how the products were doing within a local market, because what we discovered in going to the global market was the query as to how are your products consumed locally. There is a myth that that buyers globally want to have our product on a global market just because they want to. In order for them to do that, they have to understand how the product currently sells. And if you don't have a market within your own market, it's a red flag for global buyers, right? Because they can't actually say, well, this product fits well with females of a particular age, or that the product has been on the market for 3 years and therefore it is being, it's being tested well, that you haven't had any adverse effects from it, etc. So that's why it's so important for you to actually have local consumers who actually buy your product and you actually have the data on it. And then we also had some discussions with Antonio Frischini from the CNA in Italy, and he works specifically in the area of craft trades and small and medium sized enterprises in fashion. And so for persons who are jewelry makers, particularly in fashion, and accessories makers, Antonio was a great resource for them. We, as a result of that process, there was over 250,000 US in trade that occurred at CariFesta in Barbados from that grand market. Orders were placed on brands, data collection occurred. Dr. Tull would have worked with Dr. Risnigi and also collected some data for us in that exercise. And there were offers from INEX Moda, CNA Italy, and other consultants to support development going forward. So from one C to next, we were seeing the kind of activity that we wanted to occur. So we brainstormed with INEX Moda and looked at them as our global partner. Colombia then for us became a gateway into Europe, a gateway into South America, and a gateway into the USA, because we know that there were consumers from those markets coming there to shop. And we also knew that there were buyers, retail buyers, who were coming there to also shop. And so we have cemented a great partnership with INEX Moda for their 3 major fashion activities since at that time, and we've been there for the past 2 years. They identified and agreed with the challenges for us, and there was a lot of knowledge on trends. So what we also saw at CariFesta were great design products, but some of the ideas were not future. So they were almost like 2 years behind. Some of the design concepts were like 2 years behind. There was also a lack of understanding as to who the global suppliers of the raw materials were. So we may have been just going to regular stores in our various countries and ordering fabric, but that fabric is sometimes 3 seasons behind. So while aesthetically the products were made well, they were not necessarily competitive on the global market because they were a couple seasons behind. They also agreed with us that we needed to have our plants up to scratch, and there was a lack of technical design for tech packs, and those were very crucial things, because as we were taking designers from Barbados to Colombia, we were not just taking them to sell, but we were looking at the whole notion of full service companies. And full service companies can take your designs, they can mass manufacture them for you, they can deal with your distribution, and they can also retail for you. So a full service company in fashion can help you with that. So what you needed to have were these basic technical things like a tech pack. And for you designers here, you would know what your tech pack will provide to you, from sizes, the color variations, what the notion should look like, how they should be placed, what your hardware design should be, particularly from an intellectual property perspective. When you look at your hardware, you can't be having hardware that belongs to someone who you may have seen on the internet, but it should be something that you have designed that represents your brand, etc. So those are some of the things that they identified for us as a challenge. And we wanted to have a fashion system that was made up then of producers, designers, consumers, business people, creative talent, education, institutions, community, media, government. We wanted to have it all working. So we're looking at how this ecosystem would have existed, and ideally how it would increase trade. So we strategized on where we had to focus as our entry point. So remember, we would have started to plant seed, we crept, we went into the market, we did a little testing, we got some sales, and then we reflected and we had CariFesta, and we brainstormed again. So it's just showing you how this entire thing was moving dynamically. We settled on becoming strategic allies to small enterprises in shaping the direction of their business along growth trajectories that were based on their positioning in the market. So in other words, we looked, for example, at someone who may be growing cotton and producing small amounts of cotton, or who may have been who had black belly lambs and their leather could be used for accessories, etc. We also looked at designers, and we said to designers who may have small plants, how could you support the entire sector by providing specific things in terms of your skills. And we set out to provide customized support using grants for medium enterprises, allowing them to scale up in the market and maximize their business models and to impact on the players generally. So we were putting their products as well in the faces of consumers so that consumers recognize they are Barbadian designers. This is what they're producing. This is what they're creating. So this was the epic challenge that came out of that experience with INX Moda. I would say that we did meet a speed bump in terms of the financing that was required. So we had to go back again to the drawing board. But all of these things remain part of what we were doing. So accessing INX Moda's Fashion Lab, which is a research platform electronically that you can see all the trends that are going to be happening for the next 3 years. We could place designers into tutorials with global designers who were already producing. We could place the technical team through this lab with manufacturers. So there are companies like Expo Faro in Colombia who make Levi jeans. But part of the process is also looking at the actual jean fabric, how they manipulate it, how they add, for example, foil and then make that foil gold, all those kind of things. Those are things that we could have provided as access to our local manufacturers of fashion as well as the designers. Am I going too quickly for everyone? Because hello?
I'm good.
Okay, sorry, okay. And so we concentrated on the links, supporting the industry through the commercial platforms such as the trade shows. So we decided that this is what the government will do. So we would provide the grants, but we would also take their products to the market. So it meant that we would look at how they're packaged and how they're actually showcased. We would promote the business, and therefore we were the ones who would negotiate the sales as well. And we also looked at the transformation areas, human capacity, which is these are the recommendations that we would have made to government, developing teams in companies, trend transformation, and market positioning. And that's why I said that we really felt that Colombia, and then we looked at Panama, and most recently we've identified Kenya as one, and Nigeria, sorry, Kenya and Nigeria as some of the market entry points that we could possibly see consumption at large scales. And it's simply because of how many people exist in those markets, not about the US or the European market, but in Kenya, for example, you have close to 60 million people who could actually consume clothing and design products that we could produce. In Colombia alone, as I said, it's 40 million people right there. And then when if you look at the Caribbean collectively, it's another 40 million. So we've kind of looked at what the markets could be and who we could trade with. So, as I said, we had a mixed bag going to Colombia Moda last year. We took products of 20 designers after having a call from our designers. We also took their work into the US market as well and got some additional testing done there. We would have gone to Liberty Fairs in New York. We would have gone to LA Mart. We would have gone to America's Mart as well. So we did some other testing as well there. But then we literally shot the collections at Barbados on the Water, we ACP conference in Africa, as well as I said, Columbia Moda and Liberty Fairs in New York. So that's what we would have done. And we actually took 8 designers to Columbia Moda so that they understood the experience of doing business. And that worked out quite well. And 4 of those designers got orders, and they have actually filled those orders, and they are selling in some stores in Colombia. One designer is Avarx. His work is also going to be sold in Chile and Panama as a result of that next season. We've also assisted them, having got the orders, in terms of their manufacturing as well. Unfortunately, one of the other designers, he decided to pull out because of COVID. Couldn't really deal with it, but the others are still doing some work. And um, one of those companies happens to be West Indian Cotton. So we've also helped them to rethink about the manufacturing, rather than sending all of the cotton to Italy, but if they could produce it in Barbados as well. So that includes machinery for them to take the and process it. West Indian cotton cannot be produced, the lint, through a regular machine because of the length of which it actually, the length of the yarn that it gives you. So that's why there had to be a special machine, which we actually are sourcing from Colombia as well. Right. As I said, we saw fashion beyond just apparel and accessories, and we also looked at home and accents, and we would have worked closely with Union Collaborative in this, and they were part of our American Smart showcase, and we had buyers like Home Goods and Zulily.com who actually placed orders as well with some of these artisans. So when we look at the overall impact, what we saw was community employment in skilled areas, particularly in tech design and artisanal production. Cluster creation and growth representing over 40 designers and artisans, and creative economies development, developing our Barbadian brands, and this is one of the Barbadian brands which we helped through that process, Serenus. And it was also through Serenus that we really started some of our engagement with Colombia. And she is now selling her product in Europe as well, through a similar exercise, through a buyer who happened to come to Barbados and is now also buying her product. So she's carried, her swimmer is carried in Italy. We had other brands like Barbados brand Eyewear, Avark, as I said, Yandor, which is doing great with their bags, and they actually have a lot of the manufacturing in terms of the supply chain done through China. And of course, Earthworks Pottery, who has his brand now selling in the US as well. So I'm going to give you a quick example of what we've done since that time as well, and how the cluster is working. Challenges that continue to face us are financing and the banking sector. But most recently, we have been able to argue for the whole notion of using the intellectual property of your designs for collateral. Now, we would have been waiting on a study that was done in Jamaica that was funded through CDB for some of those results in terms of being able to value some of the things. But we still haven't received that data yet. And we are still exploring some of the other areas. But what we did is that we were fortunate to receive some funding from Caribbean Export. We've actually started our production cluster. And I am happy to say that that cluster is looking to address the issues we identify in terms of the packaging, deficiencies in prototypes, price points, etc. And we've had 4 online sessions already. We're now in the process where our designers are having their tech packs done. And next week, they are actually going to be having all of the collections manufactured, and then these collections will be ready for sale in January. And in the cluster, we have the designers, we have market showcase as a component. We have design technicians as part of the cluster, factory technicians as part of the cluster, and there's an actual plant that manages all of that. And this cluster itself impacted on just about 52 designers, 18 local designers, and all the others across the region. The ones across the region were only able to get the training in the specific areas electronically. So we looked at merchandising and packaging. So that is, there were persons who wanted that experience, so we would have shared that with them. We looked at the best practices in terms of selection of material, fabric treatments, etc. And we also looked at master tailoring with a very great expert out of Dominican Republic. So our goal with these 28 designers, although we only have 18, the design technicians and the factory technicians also make up that 28 because we see them all in the cluster as contributing to the design process. Our goal is to have a total of 112 collections a year. That's 336 collections over 3 years. And we have a minimum of 100 pieces per collection. And that's our target. And as you can see here, our emphasis is on tech packs, fabric manipulation, pattern making, grading, fitting, samples, branded linens and notions, branded packaging, etc. And that is essentially what Barbados has done for the past 4 years, although we're in 2020 now, so let's say 5 years, to really transform the fashion sector and position it in a way to be competitive. We still have a lot more work to do, but that's just a sense of how we have been practicing.
Okay,
Any questions?
thank you very much, Andre, for that. I always enjoy this particular presentation. Are there any questions, class? There was a lot, very rich discussion there on the fashion sector in Barbados, particularly in terms of the interventions that the government has sought to do. But you would notice that Andre's point of entry would have taken us back to where we would have begun, in a sense, with our class in terms of identifying the literature, particularly that would have been honed out of the region, and show how it has informed policy. And you would certainly get more of this next semester when you do your policy course. But it was certainly an important thing to see how the work that has been done in the region by our colleagues and persons who may have lectured us previously has influenced certainly policy and strategy in terms of how sectoral development in a very important area should take place. Right. So I believe that Janae has a question, or is it James? It's James.
Yeah. Do you
Yeah.
all need to, sorry, do you need to keep the presentation up or do you want me to end that?
I think it's up to them.
Okay.
Yes, I think so, because there's a question on one of these slides I wanted to go back to. Yes. Go ahead, James.
Yeah, first of all, I just want to say like this is like the the most impressive approach I've seen to the sector. Um, for a lot of the stuff that I've actually observed over the last few years, um, more so in the way that a lot of the things have been followed through. Um, and I think it came down to the approach at the start, like where you guys started, and the steps that you took to get from A to Z kind of thing. So I've actually been quite impressed with a lot of what I'm seeing. So I think you all are doing a good job.
Thank you. I would say that we we also looked at what we thought or we think you were doing in Trinidad as well, because there was a point in time in your fashion sector. Many of you may remember what's the street? Not Charlotte Street.
Frederick Street.
Frederick Street, which you used to
Right.
go in and they had all these seamstresses, etc. But when you started to move to your malls, like Long Circular and to West Mall, for example, that had a great impact on your fashion sector. So I think there was a great effort at that time to try to lend some this kind of similar approach. I remember there were a group of designers at that time who started to look at your plants, having plants in China. I remember Mei Ling and Claudia and what's his name? Oh, he used to do Miss
We like
Universe.
Edward Jones and stuff.
Yeah, they started that whole process, and I think it was important for them also to have stores in the malls. So you move from just having the shops in Frederick Street. But when you look at some of your local brands, you have a store in Long Circular Mall. Oh gosh, forgot its name, but they produce a lot of clothing, and we
That's
don't have.
Bang Bang,
Sorry.
Bang Bang.
The name is gone from me right now. But I know that we don't produce that quantity of clothing, and that's one of our deficiencies. So we recognize that it's important to have local consumption, and to do that, you actually have to have the storefront. So we're launching our Shop Creative Barbados platform because everybody's going digital. We've shifted our model of the brick and mortar from being a store, but rather being a warehouse, and we're doing all of the transactions digitally. But that platform is available for home and accents, fashion and apparel, health and beauty products, and that's going to be our model from 2021 going forward, and that's what we're creating as well.
I was
Um,
just wondering, the tech packs, because you hardly hear designers talking about tech packs, which is like a very important part of the process.
it
How
is.
difficult was it to have that, to get that conversation going and to train people to use it?
So what we've done is that we've essentially segmented the entire production value chain. So the designers in the cluster, we have concept designers and illustrators, because some of the concept designers can't actually illustrate, and that's a reality. And then we move to our tech teams. So you would have your pattern makers who are led by a master tailor, who oversees that, and then you have your um, persons who deal in terms of the actual stitching of the apparel. So
Okay.
we have, and it's even broken a little more than that. But within the design team, there is a concept designer, there is the illustrator, um, there is a head designer as well, who also deals with the selection of the fabric, to match the fabric with the designs. So all this cluster, we're hoping that by the time we're finished with this cluster in 2022, that the cluster is something that can be replicated across Barbados multiple times. So it doesn't have to be those specific designers alone, but we should hopefully see at least 8 of these clusters, and the way we're going to fund it is that we're going to fund the clusters with specific design things. So, for example, our concept really is to have designers for resort wear would only be in the resort wear cluster. Um, the designers who are going to be looking at accessories, that is going to be an accessories cluster. Then, and so on and so forth. But we're also thinking about a cluster that bridges design from an artisanal perspective into fashion, and that could be um, accents. So it could be furnishings, soft furnishings, etc. So this is the first full cluster that we're actually testing. We're looking at the money that's being spent, we're measuring that, we're looking at the cost for packaging, all those things we're doing in the cluster. So the cluster has all of that support going on. So as a designer, you just have to come and think about design. There is a manufacturing team that's there to support you as well. And there is a sales team that's there to support you, and a distribution team that is there to support as well.
Thank you.
Very interesting. Thanks for that. Kevin, you have a question?
Yes, I do. Thanks a lot for the great presentation, Andre. Can you tell us what were some of the intellectual property challenges that the Barbadian fashion industry faced?
So the greatest deficiency is understanding of intellectual property. So I can tell you about the cluster and I can go back. The cluster, for us, we were very clear that the cluster owns the design. So within the cluster, everyone in the cluster owns the design, and they therefore share based on what they have contributed. And it's simply because we don't just create if we're looking at it from a market-led position and based on trends. So there are influences. So unless you are creating every single thing void of that, so when you look at your mood boards, for example, your mood boards influence you in some way. So when the lead designer selects fabric, that's part of the process. If you have a technical person who actually takes their design or illustrator and place that illustration on fabric, that is also part of the intellectual property process of that particular thing that you're designing. So we've agreed, and everyone in the cluster has agreed that their share in the intellectual property from that perspective. So that's one thing. As a designer, you need to understand those elements as well. So from your hardware, there's intellectual property that's involved in your hardware, which speaks to your brand. The cost then of things like actually having your product sold globally, there are stores, retailers who would require you to register your trademark in every location that they're selling, where they're taking the product. So those are things that designers need to understand. The other thing in terms of IP, how to value the IP. Also, how to recognize that when you are designing, once you've made that, once you've placed that design into your digital space, because most people are now designing digitally, that you actually need to register that design as yours. And it's not something that you do at the end of a month or at the end of every time you create that design, you need to register that design. So there are some what do you call it, products that you use to design, that by purchasing that product, it also allows you to have your IP registered. I have to get some of the names and share those with you unless you all already know them. But that's one of the key things. And when you're thinking about intellectual property, if you're thinking about it from a management perspective as opposed to just a protection perspective, of course, that's important. You also have to know my clothing, my product, my design is going to be sold in this market, is going to be sold in this way. So I may design something at this point, but the pattern as well, I may want to have that pattern sold to someone who is doing wallpaper, or to someone who may see it and say, I want to actually reproduce this on bags if I really originally only had it for just apparel. So that's the kind of thinking you have to apply in your, what I kind of call your idea incubation stage. So when you're incubating your design, it's not just what you are sketching or what you are putting down, but also mapping where you want to place it. So once you do that, you can match the intellectual property that's required to it, and you can map the streams of revenue that you can get for it as well. So that's one of the challenges we found, that many creatives, not just designers, face, even musicians. I've just had a conversation, sorry to step up from fashion, but I just had a conversation with a DJ and had to explain to him that when he's making mixes, he is in fact an arranger. So in music, when we see scores, you may see arranged by. That person has taken the original score and arranged it. That's the same thing that this jockey does when he does a mix. So he needs to understand that he can't just take it, but perhaps need to have a conversation with the original composer, or if he is actually going to be doing the mix, he actually has to then register the mix and ensure that all the rights are paid to the original writers, etc. But he also is able to get some revenue from it. So I think broadly, we recently had our biz talks on financing as well as on IP, two different ones, but the one on IP, that was one of the greatest things we had to emphasize, that intellectual property requires planning. It's not just thinking of how to protect it. The other thing you also have to recognize is that it's also quite difficult to expensive with IP. So what you may want to do is that you may want to set agreements and arrangements that are beneficial to you and that you can get the fullest out of, because you know that you may not be able to claim the rest. And I'll give you this basic idea. When you see a Michael Kors bag come out for sale, he has sent that to a production plant, and that production plant would have probably produced the 25 million that he wanted. But they also produced an additional 10 million, because on the run, they would have probably had to produce that amount. And the 25 million Michael Kors has his hardware on it that says MK. It has the lining that has the MK and so on in it. The buckles are made specifically for him. But the actual design of the bag, there's another 10 million that some smaller designers are going to copy designers, as you know, or white labelers may get from that manufacturer. So what he is doing is he's ensuring that for the 25 million, he generates the revenue based on the hardware and the branding and the trademark on it. That other 10 million, he essentially says, I'm not going to make any money from that. But he may have said to the manufacturers, fine, I know that you're going to be making 35 million. So 25 million I am taking for me, but I want 16% of the remaining 10 million that I know you're going to sell for the design. So there's an additional license that he's also sought to make revenue from. But that's in planning. That's how you plan for it, so that people don't exploit you in a way that you may not have thought of. Because there are people who wake up and say, "Wait, that's my design. What I'm doing that way," but you probably didn't plan for it. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, Andre, thank you. Perfect.
Tonya, yes, go ahead, please. All right. Tonya is asking. Right. In the chat, she says, super insightful lecture. In fashion, do you currently see potential for growth in the textile fabric industry for the region as an exporter in selling and exporting our fabric patterns? Or do you think it is more beneficial for us to focus on the final products, whether that be a clothing line, etc.?
Okay, so I think to make it work in the region, you have to see the entire value chain. And you have to understand that we either have to decide that I'm going to grow all of my raw materials in mass places like where there is a vast amount of land to grow some of the raw materials, and perhaps see across the region, how should I put it, pockets or satellites of raw material access. So rather in Guyana, that's where all of the cotton is going to be produced. Rather in Trinidad, that's where all of your dyes are going to be made. Whether in Jamaica, through some process, that's where they are going to be producing all of the notions. In Barbados, you may decide that that's where your leathers are coming from. If you can see the region like that in terms of the manufacturing of, sorry, in terms of accessing the raw material, that solves one of our biggest issues. Because we don't have the quantities of raw materials. We're not producing them. It's not that we don't have the ability to produce them, we just are not. Singapore is the size of Barbados. Just giving you all an example. So we can do it, but you have to set out that this is what the sector is going to do. So the first part of the value chain that we want to look at is the access to raw material. And so as a region, are we going to grow enough raw material to facilitate this? Then there's no question about our design and manufacturing capability, none whatsoever. There's no question about access to global technology so that we understand trends. We then have to work on the next area, which is packaging, and how we as global consumers, because what we have to recognize is that as products of colonialism, we have only been taught how to consume what we have sent out as a raw material and was reproduced, repackaged, and sent back to us. So we have to shift that model. And the prime example of how we actually do shift that model is kind of like how we see costumes, how we pay for costumes at Carnival. Even though some people argue that some of the costumes are imported, we actually buy costumes from our local producers, if you get what I mean. So there is the opportunity to see the consumption happening. And then we also have to really get our act together in terms of how we distribute across the region. Remember, there is, 22 million people in Haiti, another 20 something in Cuba, Trinidad, y'all have 2 million people? Jamaica, across the region, we have, across the region, just the region, Guyana, across the region, you have a market of over 50 million people who could possibly consume these products. So we have to understand, where do we place the stores? Who are the retailers we're going to be working with to sell these brands? Because the quality is going to be at that level. Once it's on trend, we therefore have to look at ensuring that the marketing is at that level. What do we see globally in terms of marketing of fashion? Magazines. We see outdoor media. So there are digital catalogs of campaigns every single day. So we have to create those. We have to produce the magazines electronically or physically. We have to say what the stores are going to look like. We have to upgrade storefront. We have to understand sales. We have to understand the packaging. We have to deal with the distribution across the island. So we can't just hope that Leah is gonna send the packages, or Cal is going to go to all the islands to be able to deliver the things that are going to be produced. That entire shipping system for the region also has to be regularized. So if we can map it out and say, this is how we want to do it as a region, this is the legislation that's necessary, this is the funding that's necessary, it definitely can be done, and be done quite easily. At CARIFESTA, every 2 years, people buy 100% Caribbean products like crazy. Like crazy. They just consume them. I remember Barbados designers were sold out in 2 days. In 2 days. Trinidadian, Jamaican designers from Belize, they were sold out in 2 days because we Barbadians just came to shop because it was great to see Caribbean designers and they wanted to consume the product. And I saw the same thing happen at CariFesta in Trinidad. Um, so yeah, I think it can definitely happen. It's just ensuring that the models exist and really work out the model. So that's what we're doing. We are building our model. It takes some time, but it's what we have to do in the absence of large investment and funding. And what we're also recognizing is that there are people paying attention to it. So the funding we got from Caribbean at Sport, that was as a result of that, paying attention to what we've been doing.
Okay, great. That was very insightful. As more the questions come, Andre, it is getting even more interesting. Um, I have a question I want to ask, and then I'll allow students to continue to ask because this is very much a rich discussion. So it just occurred to me, just glancing at your last slide here about the amount of sales, 571,000 US dollars in sales when we had the CariFesta in the
250,
buyers market. Yeah,
yeah, the 250 or
I saw five generating over 571,000 US dollars in sales. But my question is though, because
well, that was, go
mm,
ahead. Go ahead.
that that reflects to me the importance of platforms such as the CariFestas buyer market. But this is coming every 2 years. Do we have other contexts for this in your region? Is there something else that members of the fashion clusters can utilize? And if not, what do you think is needed to make that happen? That is something that perhaps is roving or is happening on a more frequent basis beyond the 2 years.
Well, let me just also quantify the 571 because the 571 also includes sales as a result of the activity at CariFesta. So in other words, these were after sales, these were orders made by retailers, etc. And you would also note that it went across fashion, home essence, fine arts and craft, gourmet, particularly gourmet and literary arts, which really contributed to that. So these are all the sales that happened after CariFesta as
Okay.
well. So it's not
Andre,
just
that is Keith and my data.
yes, yeah. So
Right.
it just to give you an
Right, right.
example. There were people in the area of music, for example, and film who also got activity that happened as a result of CariFesta. So that's how we were able to measure it. So there was activity there and then
Mhm.
after as well. So that brought us to that figure.
So,
Um,
so this
so
makes my point, my question even more of keen interest to me because now it seems as though the fashion is helping to connect with some of the other important sectors that we have in the region. So yes,
yes, I think I just your question just left my head. Sorry.
I was asked, sorry, so I was asking, um, do we have other platforms such
Yes,
as that in the
right. So
region? Oh,
so
happening more.
right. So I think we don't necessarily have that. I think what we have concentrated on as a region has been festivals, and but we haven't recognized um, the value of festivals across many layers of the creative industries. So we as a region, we are great at festivals and producing festivals for music and to some extent, I would say music and masquerade, and with um, cultural traditions thrown in, because I found that we've moved from having cultural traditions at the forefront to know that we're just adding them on to the concentration of those specific festivals. But if we saw festivals from a perspective of, and we now have the food and wine in Barbados, But if we solve festivals from the perspective of the sectors, so we need more film festivals. And so we should know that there's a festival season of film in October. And you can go from Barbados to Trinidad to Jamaica to St. Lucia, etc., etc. That is the festival season. The festival season of film does that. And the festival season of film is going to impact on fashion, it's going to impact on accessories, it's going to impact on marketing, packaging, it's going to have an impact on those sectors. If we see the festival season of fashion, because we may not have a winter, a summer, and a spring collection kind of thing, we may look at perhaps because some designers may end up in a summer autumn based on what we produce, unless they are living outside of the region and they are actually doing collections based on those things. We may only end up with having maybe two seasons of fashion, but festivals of fashion. So I should be able to say, well, the quote unquote summer collections festival season is going to happen in January, February in Barbados and Trinidad, and the one for kind of autumn is going to be happening in Jamaica and Cuba, for example. And those festivals annually stimulate activity. It's going to stimulate journalism, it's going to stimulate photography, it's going to stimulate film and videography, it's going to stimulate design for sure. So those are other people that will benefit from that. And then once you have those festivals in these areas happening, and some people may say, well, apart from festival, you may want to call it event seasons or whatever, they stimulate the activity that leads towards them, towards the showing, towards the production, towards the sales. And that is how you get the consistency that's required. That's how you're going to be producing things on trends, as opposed to a designer who is only doing one collection every 5 years, as opposed to having 6 collections in a year. And that's one of the things we've emphasized as part of the cluster. You have to produce 6 collections in a year. And that's because you have to constantly, with the stores, the digital stores, you have to be changing out product almost every 6 weeks. And so our concentration is on production, on limited editions, as opposed to producing large quantities. Limited editions, because we know that once they're gone, the consumers are going to be coming back to the site to buy something fresh. And if you see yourself really trading where consumers are, because of the high activity of festivals and parties, fashion is a big seller. So people want to be able to go and buy something fresh, maybe every 6 weeks, 8 weeks. That's what we've recognized. But you can't have, as a designer, only having one collection for an entire year, and that collection perhaps only comprised of 30 units. You will never survive, really. So if you consider, as a designer, I'm going to be producing for 12 months every year, 6 collections, a minimum of 300 units. And this is how I'm going to be selling them all the time. And when you look at units, it means you're then breaking it down into sizes. So you're looking at, I'm going to be producing 10 smalls, or size 10, size 8, etc. So you then break it down that this is the unit that you're selling of this particular collection. So it really then makes sense. And then you're able to constantly update your websites, update your Facebook pages, engage in the sales and activity to keep buyers constantly coming at you. And so you have your limited collections that are supported by festival activity, and then you get the engine going. I'm sorry.
Right. Great. Thank you very much for that. I think I had one other question, and then I will ask others to continue to contribute. hearing you talk about the possibility of interconnections from very early on in the lecture, and perhaps because Esther's in this class, it crossed my mind that the beauty business is becoming a big deal again in the region in terms of beauty queen competitions and what have you. And
Queen
I
only.
wonder, yes, I wonder how in you working with fashion, you see the possibility of interconnectivity there, and how can it benefit both? Does the fashion industry see the beauty business as a supported or related sector in
Okay,
terms of competitions and what have you?
so you see, okay, so I kind of defined it a little differently. When you told me beauty, I thought you were talking about beauty products.
Mm.
But I think so you're talking about pageantry.
Correct. Yes, that's
Okay,
the term.
so
Yes.
well, they are absolutely connected if you see pageantry from a marketing perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Because and this I'm not sure if you all recognize that there are not a lot of local ads on your television about local products.
Yes, we
So,
do.
right? Do y'all have a lot of them in Trinidad?
Well, it depends on the product. I mean, if it's Angostura and Carib, I don't know. The others can
Right,
probably wait.
right, but not for beauty. So I mean, we have seen an increase in the production of beauty products. So I'm talking about soaps, makeup, um, perfumes, um, by almost 342% in the last um, 2 years in Barbados. So and a lot of natural beauty products as well. But no one has actually said, I'm going to take Miss Barbados World or Miss Barbados Universe and create a campaign with her face or her skin.
Hmm,
Um, there
interesting.
are, yeah, so there are makeup artists who would probably use them when they are using makeup by, I don't know, Estee Lauder or someone. But then when you have locals who are creating foundations and so on from healthy products, you don't see campaigns that feature them. The campaigns tend to be only about the product. But so it's a great opportunity that we're missing in having some of our local pageant um,
Mm.
participants and who could be used in fashion campaigns. I mean, like in real fashion campaigns, and you make your fashion campaigns about the actual product using these people who are quite talented and beautiful. But so it's something that we need to focus on. I can tell you that the South Americans do it very, very well. And I remember the days of, I might be aging myself, but I remember the days of your former Miss World.
Wendy? No,
You know,
Miss World is
Miss
on.
World.
The,
God,
the one that
Is that
everybody knows.
Giselle or
Well,
Giselle?
Giselle.
Giselle
Giselle.
Larod.
Giselle
There was
Laurent
a
West?
Yes, there was a campaign that Giselle did for fashion, a makeup line that y'all had many years ago, which was stunning.
mm-hmm.
So I mean, it's about shift.
Trinidad experience would be Sasha. They would
Sasha, yeah, yeah.
use the
It actually
products.
was. It was actually the Sasha brand when Sasha was first coming up.
Right. But I appreciate what you said there, because okay, and this goes to what is probably my other question, which came to mind as well, that and this is where I stand corrected by all the persons in the class, including you, Andre, who are experts in this field. But local fashion comes across as very haute couture-ish, which, in a sense, by extension,
Yeah,
sometimes means the dollar. The way in which I operate, I kind of go with I kind of go with the mood of the designer. If that fits me, I will hang in there with them.
yeah.
So
Well,
I could really wear them more than once. But to say that I would go out there and purchase a whole range of stuff from local designers, I don't know, I might have to give them my whole salary. And
Well,
so I wonder if that is not in some way a challenge or one of the reasons where commodification in terms of it being more pervasive. And how can we address that? Because we thinking in a positive way. We really
yeah,
think with the
you
challenges, you know.
yes, that was one of the challenges we identified, and I think the what we recognized was the reason why designers tend to do more couture is because of who they saw as the market, and they didn't recognize that your pret-a-porter could be a real avenue for revenue generation, and it's not just fashion designers, but you also see it from a visual artist perspective. And we now are trying to get them to shift to understanding how moving from how you can have both, I should say, as opposed to moving from how you can have both couture work and pret-a-porter work and make revenue from them and also grow a client base. Um, the reason I was saying for it is because they only produce X quantities, and if their audiences were particularly a small group of people who they were targeting. And the reality is they were targeting people who they perhaps saw as having the money,
Mm-hmm.
who could keep their brands exclusive, quote unquote,
Mm-hmm.
um, and because as a region, we always approach everything we produce with this word called high end.
Mm-hmm.
So everything we're producing, we say, this could be for a high end customer, and that's because we were still having a colonial construct in our brain
Does
because
tourism,
yeah, that
particularly in the
is
case
tourism,
of
right?
restaurants?
So you move from plantation construct to tourism construct that is still colonial. So if
Mm-hmm.
you and that's why it started by showing you the model of Singapore and China. They recognize if you start with my consumer being the person who looks like me, who wants the product like me, who could possibly afford to pay this for a good quality. Because if you look at images of um, people within the Caribbean in the 40s, 30s, 60s, they were damn good dressers. They were
Mm-hmm.
very fashionable and they were not wealthy people. But what they did is that as seamstresses, as tailors, they copied and produced and reproduced. If
Right.
you think about it, so they were fashionable. So it means that they do want your design. But if you separate yourself from them and you
Mm-hmm.
take your product into the tourist market, if you take your product in Barbados, we call it in the heights and terraces, to the well-to-do people, you
Mm-hmm.
automatically alienate an entire mass of a population who would want your product. And
Yeah.
in the in the model of how through I'm not sure if y'all have seen the whole notion of how to make the black man spend money
Mm-hmm.
because black people are some of the highest consumers um, in and perhaps maybe talking a little tunneled here, but if you look at the consumption pattern of um, the black consumer, they shop very well. They consume at high rates. So that's why they could buy and they sometimes buy what they can't afford almost like so you're going out you have to get a brand new dress they will
Mm-hmm.
consume so when you look at consumption patterns they are consumers of some of the highest quality things. They will work to get the money to buy it. But if you continue to exclude them, they then isn't that they they don't want your product. They don't know it exists because you only have it for this particular segment in the market which they are not accessing. So that's why access to foreign products becomes easier, which is the pret-a-porter product based off of a couture look or design. So you really need to shift that model. All of those are the things that we are working on as well.
Right. I see Patreon's hand is up. Go ahead, Patreon. I'm not sure if Tonya had another question. She could always go after Patreon.
Hi, good night. Thank you for a very informative lecture. This is totally outside of my field, I should say, because I'm in performing arts. I'm a dancer, dance choreographer, fire breather, and
But
you speak.
a dancer gets dressed up for her premieres.
Yes.
Sorry.
And you and you're speaking of about fashion, and I just can't help but see there's a close relationship between dance and fashion because we always need to look good and look on point.
Mm-hmm.
And most choreographers will tend to find, or the costume designer will tend to find inspiration in a dancer or a dance or choreography or any or whatsoever. So my I have like about two questions.
Sure.
I was thinking if the thought or any discussion or any idea may have come up into exploring the relationship between fashion and the performing arts, because I believe there is a relationship there, and also with reference to even dance, because dancers tend to be at the forefront during a lot of these festivals, especially carnival. Even most of the soca artists and their backup dancers, like I see that as a great avenue for the fashion industry to be exhibited on a global scale. Like, has that ever been considered, like that sort of collaboration, or is that something that is probably possible in the future?
Absolutely. And I think this is something that across the region we will probably have to really tackle, and that's the whole notion of um, seeing entertainment as more than just going to a live show. So if you think of your marionettes and when you have your dance season, um, if you have those more frequently, they will require the use of the designers for costumes. If you're producing more film, it will require the use of designers for more costume. If you have more productions, you will require that because you then start to think more of what your sets are going to be, how a dance is going to perform, what's the costume that's going to go with it. But a designer can't survive on just designing a costume for 16 dancers only once a year. And that's the reality. So what we have to do, and this is a problem across the region. I remember, and I don't know why, because I remember I was a little young, coming to Barbados and having so many activities to go to. I mean, there were dances, performances at the Frank Collymore Hall. I remember going to Jamaica to see NDTC at least twice a year. Coming to Trinidad during like your Christmas time to see the marionettes. And so there was all this activity happening, and each time there were new costumes, which meant that there were designers who were producing them. So there may be designers who want to be involved in that, but it's a lack of consistency of the entire ecosystem, and this is something that we really have to address. When you, I mean, and when you're going to a premiere, you then will be using a local designer's clothing. Janine DeBeek is one of your premier sopranos, and I mean she's doing great things across the world. In Europe, she's one of the biggest sopranos in demand at the moment. And at Carrie Festa it was last year, in 2019, in
Yeah,
Trinidad.
yeah.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
we were shopping down for dresses that she's going to be wearing at every single gig she had for the rest of 2020, 2019 and 2020. And I've
But
seen her in at least 6 of those designs that she bought at Carrie Festa. So if if you match the two, you need to have the activity, you need to have the market for the product.
But I am even thinking, Andre, notice again, music videos are becoming a big deal again because of digitization and because of the fact that we can't gather. What clothes are they wearing?
They are,
like,
so again,
I know they do use some local designers sometimes, but
yeah.
to me, it should be an automatic because, I should be able to, like Nadia Batson launched a video yesterday for her birthday. Let me see if she used a local designer. I don't know if anybody here could say before I even go and look. I go in and look.
I know people like Terencia Coward, TC, and Allison.
I think she recycled.
Yeah, they tend to.
Sorry, what is that, Jamie? She what?
I think the outfit she used to launch was something that Jamie, sorry. I think the outfit she used was something she recycled from a previous campaign, from a previous shoot.
Was it?
That's it. But no, she used it. Was it?
Was it local?
I'm not sure because I know sometimes she uses Razan to style her. I'm not sure if she used Razan for this one. Yeah. I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah, a stylist doesn't always equate to a local designer either. So, I mean, yes, there are some artists who make the conscious effort to do that. Yeah, they are.
Catalog across the region of designers. Like if I decided like a lookbook, I think that's what y'all call it in the fashion world. Because like most people have to do their own lookbooking on Instagram, if you know what I mean. Like I am someone, and I know there are many people who do this where they may be going to something and they think about how they want to feel, or at least I do that, how they want to feel at this event, and I decide I might give James a call. James knows this too because I use his stuff sometimes. And I wonder if this would not be easier if there was a digital lookbook. If someone could say, based on my mood, I could go onto this platform and see the designers. Is this something that perhaps could be done through Carrie Festa, knowing that we have the buyer's market? Is this something that's cost a lot of money? What do you think, Andre? Thoughts on that?
Well, having the collections through the cycles I would have explained earlier would require that you need to do a level of editorial that would facilitate that for you if you are thinking seriously about having your collections for sale and global consumption and digital sales, etc. So that would solve that problem. In terms of the attempt to have it as a collective regional thing, we would have to create a regional marketplace for that to occur. I can tell you that our attempts to do that in Carifesta proved very futile because most of the designers, apart from maybe about 14 of them, and those were the only ones we were able to post, had already made their collection. So they knew this is my collection for 2017, and the collections were going to be sold at these trade spaces or in this particular way. Several of the other designers, up until maybe the week of Carifesta, were still producing, still designing, still making.
Right.
So it is something that could happen, but you need to understand and we had huge deadlines, which we changed and we tried to facilitate, but some people just couldn't do it, and it's because of their production cycles and how they produce. So that's why as I was saying, it's important to know so the entire, when you're planning your design, you need to understand it's going here. I want it shown in this particular place. I want it to be this particular product because this is the market I am targeting. This is the market who is most likely to shop every single week on my website, who would want to see something fresh every 6 weeks, who may buy something today and buy something in 4 days. It's all that needs to occur. Now, as a designer, you may get frustrated and say, I can't do all of that. I need somebody. So this is where, students in our program in Barbados, which we have at BCC, this is what we're training them to become the business.
Community college, for those of you who don't, that's like Costa.
Yeah. So, and I think UTT also has this program. I'm not sure, and I believe that you also have students in your program who would probably be interested in the business side of it. And so the goal is that at the end of the day, we have business support people functioning in these sectors because that's what you need. Because creatives, people who are just creating who want to just create, they don't have time for all the other things to support them. So
Right.
you need to have people who are involved in that process as well.
Okay. Okay. Wow. This has been quite enlightening. I have a trick question for you, on the spot question. So, you know what Paris is to fashion. So, what's the Paris in the Caribbean?
Of fashion,
Mm-hmm.
woo. I would be honest with you. I still think that Trinidad is the Paris of fashion. From a design perspective, um, I think that Jamaica is the Italy of fashion from a manufacturing perspective.
Where does Haiti fit in this? Because when I go to, because for me, Haiti fashion is like the Mercedes Benz. Like I go to Cari Fest every year. My daughter and I, well, Andre, you know this, Gabriella is a shock freak in the Grand Market. If she could buy the whole Grand Market. That hasn't changed from Barbados, by the way. It was the same
Yeah.
thing in Trinidad. Um, but we always watch the Haitian booth and say, oh boy, next year. Because when you watch that price tag, where does Haitian fashion fall in all of what you were just saying there?
I think they're
Is
very
that
much. I think they're
full?
very much um, the American market of fashion in the region, and I think it's because of you could see in Haiti
Mm-hmm.
design design that is different,
Mm-hmm.
but you could
Definitely.
also see multiple similarities of a
Mm-hmm.
design by several designers. If you get
Mm-hmm.
what I'm saying.
They arrive at the costing. Where is that hedged on? Is
And
it percent tied to France, for example? Where does that come from?
I think they have Haiti has the manufacturing down pat simply because they also produce um, for several companies out of the US. So
Mm-hmm.
some companies would go into Haiti and set up the infrastructure. So they bring in the technology as well.
This
And
sounds
they
like
use,
music industry in the Caribbean years ago.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and they use they use the Haitian designers to conceptualize and they handle all of the production. So they would tackle trends. So when you see a Haitian design that stands out,
Mm-hmm.
it's a one who's made a significant effort to stand out as a Haitian designer. But you could
Right.
easily find many designers, Haitian designers, producing similar things, and so they have the approach of the manufacturing en masse for sale en masse. So that's why they kind of have that down pat. It's like DR.
Mm-hmm.
DR has a similar model. So that's
Okay.
why people would say, well, go to Dominican Republic and have it manufactured. You can get it manufactured cheaper.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the difference is that the Haitians will probably bring a little more design aesthetic to it. While in DR, they will know this is for the leisure market, which means that we're going to have maybe 2,500 um, boats that have stores on the actual ships, and
Mm-hmm.
that's where the clothing is going to be, or the clothing is going to be sold on the ship. So every
Mm-hmm.
time the ship docks in DR, they
Mm-hmm.
send the clothing onto the ship. So, uh, they know that they're going to sell. That's how they're going to make the money. So it's So they kind of have the manufacturing process in terms of reproduction and spitting it out down pat. And well, I would say that we um, in the Southern Caribbean, we're we're still great at design. We're still great at having one of a kind pieces. So you're not going to see a 16 people in the same thing.
From
In the
me.
same thing.
Right.
Yeah. So we're kind of like that's what I'm saying. Trinidad is really like the Paris to me. And
I
Jamaica.
think we kind of like that. I mean, I'm not picking on him in the class, so it kind of, but I mean, that's the designer that I have engaged with a lot in that regard, and I kind of like the fact that I probably was the only person in Barbados with this sailor-like looking pants that I
Yeah.
wore that cruise. You know the
Yeah.
one, right? We
Yeah.
have,
Yeah.
but at the same time, being someone who is supportive of all of these sectors, I would be happy to see where we get to a place where, like what Radical did do. And I mean, the Radical model did receive challenge over the years because we know that Radical has closed down stores and that kind of thing. Not to dwell on the negatives because there was so much good, good news that you brought to the class. What happens there? Is it economies of scale? Is it not giving the right enabling environment? I don't feel is that the market lost interest because people, to me, always like wearing radical design, for example. And I felt that if it could happen to them, it could certainly happen to a lot of the other design houses or designers that we have in Trinidad and Tobago. What do you think accounted for them having to scale back, as we've seen?
Well, I know that Radical, because it existed in Barbados, and I think
Yeah.
that the owner at the time also they also would have invested in this other brand. Oof, it's gone from my head. I can see it.
Anybody?
Um,
I don't remember.
um, it's a European brand, but they had both stores, and
Oh,
so yeah,
okay.
they had both stores. So Radical was on one end of Broad Street, on Lower Broad Street, and this other brand was in Upper
Benetton?
Broad Benetton. There you go.
I
And
that Dunn
yeah,
says that, I
so
I remember this.
so I remember that owner having both stores. So when it came to the cost, I think they made a, a decision
Miss
in
Al-
closing the Radical brand, and they just kept the Benetton because of the what they saw as a global reach.
Hmm,
Um, yeah, that I
hmm,
remember would have been one of the reasons. Um,
okay.
the other thing is that Radical did also have an issue in terms of refreshing their brand. I'm
Right.
not sure if y'all see that in Trinidad, but um, I think they had an issue in shifting away from the white and the prints,
Mm-hmm.
um, and some of the structured work you saw a couple
Mm-hmm.
seasons repeated. And I think that if you look at the um, life cycle of any product, if you
Mm-hmm.
don't innovate and constantly shift, even if you have incremental innovations,
Mm-hmm.
um, when you get to that point in your life cycle and you don't do that, your product will die naturally. I still see them in West Mall. Uh,
Yes.
I,
Yes.
I still have family who say when I'm going to Trinidad, could you pick me up a Radical shirt? Because they
Mm-hmm.
still believe in the brand. Um, but then there's also the issue of the price point. So
Mm-hmm.
your price matching your price point with trending and new product also to me is where they've blurred the lines. And then when you
Right.
have other players stepping in the market who are offering um,
Yeah.
similar products, maybe at a
Because certainly
smaller
in the
rate.
line shirts, we have like Saga Boy culture now,
Exactly.
which is my colleague, and that's a nice line of t-shirts, which
Yeah,
kind of go along what Radical might have been
yeah,
doing in a sense.
yeah.
Maria wants to ask a question. Go ahead, Maria, please. I just saw you commenting, but please do ask your question.
Okay,
Oh,
I just wanted to.
they opened a
Sorry.
branch to the gate
Yeah,
last
they
month.
did.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the game.
So
I just
going
wanted
from
to know what are
station to
the
model.
key trends in the fashion industry right now?
In the Caribbean or globally?
Both.
Ah, globally,
Globally, regionally.
all right.
You know, you notice this class is different from, I mean, last semester, the
Yeah,
questions were quite engaging, but you understand, they
yeah.
hitting harder.
I think globally, one of the biggest challenges is that there are, and I'm looking at the industry not just from the designer's perspective, but even suppliers have stopped stocking supplies, and it's really to get rid of any stock that they have. We found in LA, for example, one of our suppliers literally sold a stock worth probably around 360,000 US. He sold that stock um, to someone for $40,000. So it's almost as if the smaller players within the value chain who would have come in the value chain and offered um, access to smaller competitors. And I say smaller in terms of quantity production. Um, that's causing those designers to suffer because if I can't go to a buyer who would allow me to have a minimum number of bolts, maybe like 20 bolts of fabric, but I have to go now to a buyer whose minimum order of bolts are 50 bolts. That's going to impact on a smaller designer. Um, so what we are seeing from that perspective is that there's some designers who've given up on fashion, and there's some suppliers who are literally leaving the sector. From from a distrib- from a sales and distribution perspective, you know that everyone is going global. So a lot of the um, physical shows and retail markets like Columbia Moda, LMR, a lot of them are going digital. So what it's forcing designers to do is actually work more on their editorial and videos. So you're seeing designers now having more video campaigns about their products and having more digital editorials there. So that's a plus in design because some designers just didn't do that. So you have them, more concentrated on that. There's a complete shift of the model from the brick and mortar store. Not that the stores are people are giving up all of the space because there are people who are still holding on to their storefront, but their storefront is also acting as a warehouse simply because they can't afford warehouse storage. So in the value chain, warehouse storage after production is also impacted on, and that is also impacting on distribution. So some designers are also now just manufacturing and producing in their own jurisdictions. So they've reduced their global distribution and global manufacturing as well. So where you may see a designer who would have probably produced in Colombia and have all their stuff distributed by Colombia, they're based in the US, they're now just manufacturing in the US, and their storefront is also acting as storage, and they're handling their own distribution. So there's a shift there as well. So the global supply chain is completely out of whack, and people are rethinking it. They're doing different things to save costs. It impacts then on global consumption, but provides an opportunity for emerging brands who have the facility and the wherewithal to step up. So you're seeing a lot of designers, for example, trading on Instagram, selling on Instagram, And in the Caribbean, with things like Republic Pay and those sort of digital ways of collecting money globally, we're seeing an increase in designers who are selling their products online. The challenge they are still faced with, however, is distribution, and the cost of shipping is extremely high with DHL and FedEx. So some of those trends are really impacting the supply chain and the pipeline. From a design perspective, people are still releasing their collections, strangely enough, but they are having challenges in sales. So yeah, those are some of the things that we've observed and we have been focusing on. So, for example, we did have an intention to have our collections released in December, and we've kind of said, no, let's put them back in January, so that what we can do is that when the trade shows open at the end of March and April, we then can have those collections there as well. And so we are doing collections for January, we're having collections for April, we're having collections for July, and we're having collections for October. So we've drifted down from the 6 to 4.
Okay, interesting. Jamie, you have a question?
Yes. Hi, good evening. I wanted to know if you knew, Mr. Hoyte, do you see the Caribbean fashion industry in general being greatly impacted by things like infringement of intellectual property? And if you do, you think or if you don't, if the Caribbean has adequate protection for these things? Because you know, like the lawsuits they have with Louis Vuitton and oh gosh, I've got the other people. Yeah, so that.
The short answer to that is no, and it's because, for example, Louis Vuitton, in terms of his shoes, they just started to innovate. Um, I don't even have the article I could send to you, but they just started looking at innovations to protect the same example I gave you of Michael Kors in terms of people who are manufacturing for them that manufacture excess and then sell that excess, almost like the bootleggish. Um, and I think because they were initially only concentrating on their orders, they never really paid attention to that. And then you also have designers who, as you know, would dump their own products rather than to give them to people because they don't want the value to drop. Um, in the Caribbean, I don't think that we actually produce a mass like that to think about it. There may be individual designers who do go about protecting their design through the different systems. And I know in Barbados there is no body for designers to protect their designs. Um, so the only thing you can really protect is your trademark.
Okay, so I'm now going to ask you
Right.
if
So
that's available. Yeah.
right. So we don't actually have a designers association who can lend the advocacy
Mm-hmm.
for like that. So you have in writing, you have B copy, which protects the writers, and we have our people who are registered with archival for some of the other. But the biggest challenge you find is that there, there really isn't a facility to protect the
Mike,
design.
Mike.
Right. There really isn't a facility to protect the design unless you're using, as I said, those kind of programs that allow you to do it, where you register a design almost like how you would register to get an ISBN for a book. Um, but what I can tell you is that we have had designers who are trading, who have had offers to sell their products in Europe, and we have covered the cost of their trademarks for those designs, for the trademark good to be sold in Europe. And that's a requirement, particularly in Italy and in Spain. So we have helped them to cover the trademark of those collections. But the cost is so high that they haven't, I mean, they've only trademarked literally 4 collections. And those 4 collections, what they were trademarking would be their hardware and their trademarkable of their actual product. Because the stores that they were selling to required that. But we've only had about 4 designers who have requested it from us. We do have a fragrance designer who does fragrances and wellness products and beauty products and soaps, who uses a particular Barbados molasses. There's something called Barbados molasses, which only until she needed to trademark it to have it sold in the UK, that the people who owned the molasses facility got their papers straight so that she could actually get her trademark with the molasses sorted out. And that's more industrial design perspective, or scientific design, because within the product she is using this special Barbados molasses. So that had to be protected. The good thing is that she was able to do that without other persons being able to copy it, because once you move to the stage of sharing that industrial design, so in fact, what she actually did was to actually put it on the trade secrets to have it registered, by the way. But once you make it public, in one of the requirements for an industrial design, you have to make it public. So the components of what were going into those products had to be publicized. So the way around it was for her to do a trade secret of that actual thing. It's almost like Kentucky Fried Chicken in terms of the flavor.
Or bitters.
Or Angostura bitters. So she had to go about it that way. But one of the things that stopped her was the recognition of the actual ingredient as a Barbados special molasses. So they were able to do that, and then she was able to approach it from a trade secret perspective. So there are people who are doing it on a large scale. I don't think so, because it is quite expensive. So people tend to go on agreements only. So if I am going to be manufacturing 30,000 units of this, the agreement is based on the 30,000 units. And so they kind of don't have control of the revenue that's generated from anything that's produced outside of that. There are many designers who, particularly the designers who are designing to have their product reproduced as prints on shirts, on fabric, on accents, furnishing, etc. They're the ones who are going through some of these digital platforms to do that, and they are being paid very little, but the platform doesn't oftentimes offer them the protection for the reproduction. And that's because you could take there's some massive machines that can do digital prints on fabric, that you can take a photograph and you can scan that photograph, and that print could be reproduced and reproduced and reproduced and reproduced. So it really requires you to think about, when you place that print on Zulily, for example, that it states clearly, to use this print, the license fee is $3 for every 600 copies made, and you are required to produce a minimum of 300 copies. What that does is that it forces the website who does it to ensure that the person who prints pays you for the 300 copies. It's that kind of thinking and planning that you have to be involved in. If that makes sense. I'm not sure if that helps.
Yes, it makes sense, because I was going to add to what you're saying, is that what is copyrightable in fashion would be things like the artistic prints, two-dimensional designs and things like that, right? And you would patent things like special designs, special patterns.
Yeah.
the cut of the garment. As you said, trademark is one of the things I saw when in my research.
Yeah,
But
patterns
Mhm.
are also hard for you to protect, because once you get the product out there, as you know, there are some people who could pick, as we say in Barbados, pick your design, use tracing paper or fabric, and they actually will cut your design. And there are many people who make money as copy designers. And, you know, the perfect example of that would be Zara. That's their business model.
Yes.
Okay.
So you either decide that you're going to enter the market with that knowledge, and you say up front, okay, I know my designs is something that Zara would possibly want, and so I am going to be approaching Zara, I'm going to be approaching H&M, I'm going to be approaching all these people and say, look, these are my designs, you may find them fashionable, this is how much it is to use it, it's a very competitive rate, I just want to be on your radar, so that you make some money from it, and you know you can make money from it, but you plan for that, and that's the way you have to really. Unfortunately, you really have to move.
Okay.
Right.
Last thing before I go. So what about jewelry?
Woo. Jewelry is
Okay.
interesting.
Let me give the context for asking the question, because jewelry is something that I think is, well, yes, I'm thinking it's copyrightable because it would be something separate to the actual design that you would wear on the clothes, right? Because they can be considered sort of a miniature sculpture in themselves.
Yes, but the thing about jewelry is that it's the mold. It is the mold that you have to. It's the mold that you have to. You have to
Mold.
protect the
Yes.
mold. So whatever mold you've created the piece from, that you're going to reproduce. The thing is with jewelry, if you have signature pieces, you know, you may be able to copyright those, but you have to ensure that the mold, you own the mold, because oftentimes as a jewelry maker, you may not be the person who, well, you could be. Sometimes you're not the person who actually controls how it is molded, if you get what I'm saying.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you have to ensure that you pay for your mold. Even when you're doing hardware as a designer, you need to ensure that you pay for your mold, that no one else can use your mold to reproduce it, and that you own your mold. So if I am paying a manufacturer in Medellin to manufacture for me, every time I get the mold done for my bag hardware, or the hardware for my belts, or the hardware for my shoes, I need to take that from him. I need to be in possession of it, because it's the mold that they can then reproduce on. And if you don't have it in your hand, you really can't control the IP there. But when it comes to other forms of accessories or jewelry, I think the opportunity to protect it is there. How you do it, it is quite maybe quite challenging. You'll probably have to focus on the trademark of the hardware for the jewelry. So, for example, let's say you're doing earrings, the hardware on the clip, let's say like a back clip, that is perhaps where you may be able to place your trademark. So, yeah, you have to think about where you want to place it and how you want to then use the IP for that.
Yeah, I agree with you with the clipper and trademark, but you could also copyright the design.
Yeah, the design for
Yeah.
sure. But
Okay.
but yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah, no.
Well, class, I
Oh,
think that has been a great evening, well spent, quite belly full in terms of learning about the fashion sector in Barbados, but most certainly what I found quite engaging from Andre is letting that stretch across the region and allowing us to have a sense of that interface between what is happening from the creative side and what is happening from the industry development side. And I really appreciate that, Andre. Um, could I ask Maria on behalf of the class to give a vote of thanks to Mr. Hoyte for giving us of his time and talent this evening? Where's Maria? Is she still around?
I'm right here.
Yes.
So,
You
Mr.
do the
Hoyt,
honor.
on behalf of cohort number 2 in the ACAM postgrad diploma, I would like to formally say thank you so much for a very informative lecture. All of us, I'm sure, gained a wealth of knowledge tonight, and it has been very insightful. I myself I feel very encouraged about what we learned today and hearing all of these initiatives going around regionally in the fashion world and well in the creative sector as well. So thank you so much. We thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm sure I could speak for everyone I said that. So thank you.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me again, Dr. Tell.
No problem.
And this is I'm very passionate about this. I also teach. My last class is tomorrow. They get to submit their projects in creative and cultural entrepreneurship.
Oh, they have the same
Uh,
thing. Look at that.
yeah. So we are hoping that that class they're going to be the third set of students who will graduate that can then go and support um, the creatives. So I'm always willing to share because I think this is an exciting sector and industry that we have not really um, paid a lot of attention to from an investment perspective in terms of money. And I think that's what we need to do. And I think we're going to be able to turn that tide by next year because we've seen so many creatives, particularly in COVID, give out and put out so much creativity, even more than um, they would normally do, to my mind. This year in Barbados, we didn't have the Crop Over Festival, but I literally produced more than 32 digital events while we were at lockdown. And every week we were showcasing persons who had designed new bags, who had designed a new piece of cosmetic, new clothing, even down to shoes. We've been just featuring people constantly. So it shows that we may be on a new normal because clearly the old normal was not necessarily working as best as it could for us. So yeah. So thank you again for having me.
Great. Thank you. All right, class. I think that we deserve to put a pause for